The train whistle cut through the hot afternoon air as Dustwood Station trembled with the arrival of a battered locomotive, its iron wheels screeching against the rails before it ground to a halt in a cloud of steam and dust. And from the open doors of the last car stepped passengers, ranchers, prospectors, women clutching children, and finally a lone figure, a young woman clutching a worn leather satchel to her chest, her dress wrinkled from days of travel, her eyes scanning the station platform with a nervous flicker of hope that quickly collapsed into unease when she realized that everyone else was being claimed by loved ones, husbands, and employers, while she stood alone, an unclaimed parcel left behind in a crowd that quickly thinned. The letters she had carried so close to her heart now felt like cruel scraps of paper, promises from a man who had written flowery words of devotion, urging her to leave behind the small town she had known all her life and come west to begin a marriage. But as the last handshake and embrace concluded on the platform, it became clear to her that he had never truly intended to meet her, or worse, that he had abandoned her deliberately, and with each passing second, shame and dread seeped deeper into her chest, making her feel exposed before the strangers who whispered and glanced her way. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the planks of the platform, but instead she stood rigid, clutching her satchel, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain someone could hear it, until a voice as steady as the earth itself broke through her spiraling fear, a low, firm voice that carried both authority and kindness. "Ma'am, is someone here for you?" She looked up and saw him, Sheriff Boone, tall and broad-shouldered, his frame casting a long shadow across the platform, his badge glinting in the sun, his weathered face both strong and softened by the faint trace of sorrow in his eyes. He had been stationed near the train to keep order, to make sure no fights broke out among the cowhands and drifters. But when his gaze had fallen on the solitary woman who looked as though the world had forgotten her, something inside him stirred, not just the duty of a lawman but the ache of a widower who knew too well what loneliness could do to a soul. She swallowed hard and shook her head, her voice barely audible as she confessed, "No one came for me. I was supposed to be met." And her words faltered as her throat closed with the weight of disappointment. Her cheeks flushed with humiliation, and Boone's jaw tightened. Not out of judgment, but out of anger at the faceless man who had left her stranded. For a long moment he said nothing, studying her with the careful eyes of a man who had seen too much suffering in his years, and then, with quiet resolve, he said, "You can't stay out here, not with the sun going down and no place to go. I've got a spare room at my place, safe and proper. You're welcome to it until you figure out your next steps." And though pride made her hesitate, though every warning bell in her head told her not to trust too easily again, something in his tone was unshakably honest, like bedrock beneath shifting sand. And against her fear she found herself nodding. The walk through Dustwood's main street was like stepping into the pages of a book she wasn't sure she belonged in, with townsfolk pausing to stare, whispers rising behind half-raised hands, some curious, others disapproving. But Boone paid them no mind, his stride even and sure, his hat tipped low as if shielding her from their stares. And for the first time since stepping off the train she felt a measure of safety. His house stood on the edge of town, modest but well kept, with a wide porch and the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from the chimney. And when he opened the door to usher her inside, she was struck by the warmth of the place, not grand or lavish but lived in, with shelves lined with old books, a worn rocking chair near the fire, and the subtle traces of a woman's touch that time had not erased. A folded quilt, a vase long emptied of flowers, the faint lingering scent of lavender. Boone showed her to a small room once used for sewing, its window looking out over the prairie, and as she set down her satchel, she felt an unexpected wave of gratitude, her eyes stinging with unshed tears she didn't want him to see. But when she whispered a shaky "thank you," Boone met her gaze and said something that made her chest ache. "Trust doesn't make you a fool, miss. It makes you human. The fool is the one who breaks it." And in that moment, Clara, because that was her name, Clara Whitfield, realized that perhaps she had not been entirely foolish to believe in kindness, because kindness was standing before her in the form of a widowed sheriff, who had every reason to keep to himself, yet had opened his door to her. That night, as Boone sat by the fire nursing a mug of coffee, staring into the flames that reminded him of nights long ago when his wife sat by his side, and Clara unpacked the few belongings she carried in her room, both of them found themselves thinking of what had been lost and what might still be found, though neither dared put those thoughts into words yet, for it was too soon, too fragile. The town would continue to whisper, Boone knew, and Clara feared what tomorrow would bring. But for now there was a fragile truce against the loneliness that had threatened to swallow them both, a fragile beginning to something neither of them had expected when the train first pulled into Dustwood that day. And now, dear listener, if you find yourself drawn into the lives of Clara and Sheriff Boone, if you want to see how this story of second chances, whispered doubts, and unexpected love unfolds, then take a moment to subscribe to this channel right now, because the journey ahead will carry heartbreak, courage, and the promise of a love worth staying for. And you won't want to miss a single heartbeat of it. In the days that followed Clara's arrival at Sheriff Boone's home, Dustwood's rhythms continued as if nothing had changed. The saloon filled with laughter and brawls. The blacksmith hammered iron until sparks flew. Children chased each other down the dusty lanes. But for Clara and Boone, life began to move in a quieter, more uncertain cadence, one that tested their patience, their courage, and the fragile thread of trust binding them together. At first, Clara rose early, determined not to be a burden, tidying the house, cooking simple meals, and mending torn shirts Boone had long neglected. And though her hands shook from nerves at times, she carried herself with quiet determination. But outside the walls of the sheriff's home, the town remained a harsher judge, whispers coiling in every corner, accusing her of being no better than a runaway woman or a schemer seeking shelter under the sheriff's roof. And though Boone ignored them, Clara felt the sting, the weight of disapproving stares whenever she walked into the general store or passed by the churchyard. One afternoon, as she returned from buying flour, a pair of women blocked her path, their voices sharp as knives as they asked how long she intended to stay under Boone's protection, and Clara, though trembling inside, lifted her chin and replied softly that she had nowhere else to go but would never dishonor the man who had shown her kindness, and she hurried away, the words still burning in her chest when she reached the safety of Boone's porch, where he found her with damp eyes and clenched fists. His expression darkened as she recounted what had happened, and though he wanted to storm into town and silence every wagging tongue, he instead took her hands, his rough palms enveloping her delicate fingers, and said in that steady voice of his, "Let them talk, Clara. They don't know you the way I do, and they never will unless you give them the power to don't give them that power." And something in his conviction rooted itself inside her, reminding her that dignity was not given but claimed. Their bond deepened in small, unremarkable moments that grew into something remarkable, a smile shared across the dinner table, laughter over burned biscuits, the quiet peace of evenings spent by the fire when Boone read aloud from an old book and Clara sewed by lamplight, her eyes occasionally lifting to watch the shadows play across his face. Yet Boone wrestled with his own demons in the silence of night. For though he had long buried his grief, Clara's presence had stirred feelings he had sworn he would never allow himself again, feelings that made his chest ache with longing and fear in equal measure. For to love again meant to risk loss again, and he wasn't sure his heart could survive another grave. But Clara, though uncertain of her worth, sensed the walls he kept around himself, and rather than retreat, she began to meet his guarded kindness with gentle persistence, showing him that companionship did not erase the past but could honor it by building something new upon its foundation. Then one evening when the sun bled crimson across the horizon and the prairie wind whispered through the grass, Boone found Clara sitting on the porch, her eyes distant, and when he asked what troubled her, she confessed in a trembling voice that she feared she was only ever someone's burden, first abandoned at the station and now clinging to a man who owed her nothing. And Boone's chest tightened as he realized the depth of her wounds carved by betrayal and neglect. And without hesitation he said, "Clara, listen to me, you are no one's burden. You are the reason my house doesn't feel like a tomb anymore. The reason I remember what it feels like to laugh, to care. You've given me more than you know." And as his words hung in the air, tears welled in her eyes, not from sorrow but from relief, because for the first time she believed she might truly belong. Their fragile peace was tested when trouble rode into Dustwood one stormy night in the form of outlaws who sought to claim the town's saloon and push out anyone who stood in their way. And Boone, as sheriff, could not ignore the threat. Leaving Clara pacing in the darkened house, praying for his safe return, her heart torn between fear and pride, for she knew the man who had saved her from despair was risking his life to save everyone else. When Boone finally returned, weary and bruised but alive, Clara rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she cleaned the cuts on his brow. And in that tender moment, as thunder rumbled outside and the storm battered the windows, Boone reached for her hand and whispered, "I don't want to face another night wondering if I'll come home to an empty house and stay, Clara, not just in my spare room but in my life, in my heart." And her breath caught, for the proposal was not grand or rehearsed but raw and real. The words of a man who had lost much yet dared to hope again. She answered not with hesitation, but with the certainty born of every moment they had shared, whispering yes through her tears. And in that embrace the wounds of abandonment and grief began to knit together into something stronger than either had known before. As the weeks passed, Dustwood's whispers shifted from scandal to admiration, for it became clear to all that the sheriff and the woman, once left unclaimed at the station, had found in each other a bond forged not from convenience but from courage. And Clara, once a stranger searching for a place to belong, became a symbol of resilience, her presence softening Boone's hardened edges while his steadfast love gave her the reason to stay. The house no longer felt haunted by the ghost of what was lost, but alive with laughter, with shared meals, with evenings on the porch watching the stars. And though Boone would always carry the memory of his late wife, he now carried it not as a chain but as a light that guided him into a future he had never imagined. And so their story became not just one of rescue but of redemption, not just of shelter but of home, reminding everyone who watched that even in the harshest lands of the Wild West, love could bloom in the most unexpected soil. And now, dear listener, if this story of second chances, whispered fears, and a sheriff's steady heart has touched you, then take a moment to subscribe to this channel right now, because many more tales of resilience, love, and redemption await, and you won't want to miss the next journey into the Wild West where every soul carries a story worth telling.